child, Bible stories were very familiar to me. It seemed like we went through every story every year in Sunday school and vacation Bible school at Zion Lutheran Church in Kerrville. When you were a child, did your Sunday school sing, Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. And as the Savior passed that way, he looked up in the tree and he said, Zacchaeus, you come down, for I'm going to your house today. I'm going to your house today. We would get a card with the story on one side, and on the other side, a picture of Jesus with a crowd of people. And Jesus was looking up, talking to a man in a tree. Our teacher told the story and gave us each a green construction paper tree so we could draw Zacchaeus in it, along with apples and bird nests or cats or whatever we wanted to add. As small children, we understood how you would have to climb a tree if you wanted to see Jesus. And it would be fun, like being in a tree house or like sitting on your dad's shoulders to watch a parade. A year or two later, we had the story again and took parts to act it out. Since I was a girl, I didn't get to be Zacchaeus or Jesus, but I did get to be one of the crowd who shouted, "Don't talk to him." Later, we learned that Zacchaeus was a tax collector, so nobody liked him. But Jesus picked him out anyway and called him by name. It was like not being invited to a party, but then somebody else, maybe somebody better, invited you to their party. Still later, we heard that the Jews hated Zacchaeus because he was a Jew like them, but he collected taxes for the wicked Roman government. Oh, so he was a traitor, like Benedict Arnold in our history class, or Uncle Tom that we knew from English class. And the crowd of Jews were shocked that Jesus was going to Zacchaeus' house. And so was Zacchaeus. He repented right away. He promised to give half his money to the poor and to reimburse fourfold anyone whom he had cheated. And then he opened up his fine house and threw a feast for everyone in town. You can tell that that story was selected for inclusion in the Bible by a committee, because if a folklorist or a storyteller had been telling it after the feast, they would have said, "I know. I was there, and the taste of that sweet wine is still on these lips." And of course, part of the story, as it was told to me, was about the power of Jesus, the omniscience of Jesus, knowing Zacchaeus' name without even being told, the forgiveness of Jesus, who knew Zacchaeus' many sins. The side with love position of Jesus, who would go to the house of a social outcast. And if all that happened in the story of Zacchaeus, you can just imagine what happened with the Easter story, told for 6 weeks every spring for the first 2 decades of my life. Or the Christmas story, told from Thanksgiving to Three Kings Day with carols, a well-rehearsed pageant, magical candlelight, a huge Christmas tree with symbolic ornaments, and even a life-size manger scene outside with a live sheep in it. Later, I came to believe that that story and all the other stories in the Bible were just lies. I had been brainwashed by having heard them told so beautifully with crayons and paste and art and music and theater and lighting even. But the people who brainwashed me had been brainwashed themselves. So, I don't know. Maybe they were innocent too. What with all that power of God stuff in the story. What I didn't realize was that in my disbelief, I was throwing out the baby with the bathwater. The story was a great story. Sometimes a wee person like a child is recognized and acknowledged by someone famous. Sometimes when you're not invited to a party, another friend or even a stranger comes along and takes you to a movie or something. All of those stories, true or not, had much truth in them. And what I believe now is that just because I parted ways with the faith tradition that gave rise to the story shouldn't mean I have to give up the story. What I'm really rejecting is someone else telling me what the story means. Let me figure that out for myself, which is something I'd say about any story. You see, telling people what the story means just ruins it. Don't you just hate a story that ends, and the moral of this story is, like you couldn't figure it out for yourself? In fact, most stories are filled with many meanings, layers of meaning. It's open to many perspectives and interpretations. Little Red Hen, for example, it's one of those stories that's been associated with one meaning, one moral, for so long that it's lost its claim to all other meanings. It's lost the power to stimulate a listener's imagination. I can just say Little Red Hen and you'll think something like, oh yeah, he who does not work does not eat. But that's not the way I tell it. You remember the Little Red Hen. She got really excited one day when she found a grain of wheat. She wanted it to be planted, which doesn't really sound like a chore that requires multiple workers. But nevertheless, she asked 3 neighbors for help. Traditionally, the cat, the goat, and the duck. And all 3 told her no. So she said, all right, then I'll do it myself. And the same thing happened when she asked them to help her water it and harvest it, and again when she asked them to winnow it or grind it into flour and bake bread. At last, she asked for help eating it, and all agreed. And then she revealed that her final request had been merely a setup for her to spring her revenge upon them. Oh, no. She said, and then she began to itemize all their shortcomings. You did not help me plant the wheat. You did not help me water the wheat or harvest or winnow or grind the wheat or bake the flour into bread. So I and my chicks will be the only ones who can eat the bread. Having a little trouble here with the fingers. I guess she told you. Now, I get the moral, I really do, but my attitude toward the hen is this. I have known people like her all my life. It's all about them, their idea of what everyone else should do and when they should do it. I wonder if the Little Red Hen ever took into account that the animals had their own busy lives to lead. What if the cat was a teacher? She had spent all day at school with other people's children, including the little red chicks, and she needed her evenings to check homework and make lesson plans. Did she know that the goat was working at Barnes & Noble during the day and going to school at nights and weekends to try to make a better life for his family? Did she ever wonder why the duck just played music all day? He played bassoon in the San Antonio Philharmonic, and he's giving music lessons to make ends meet, for heaven's sake. I ask you, who is she to take offense when her neighbors don't come running to help her with a stupid grain of wheat? I've known people like that. I've worked with people like that. I'm kin to people like that. So when they finally relent and accept her brunch invitation, couldn't it be that the duck and the cat and the goat felt bad for ignoring her all those months? And they thought the least they could do was to come over and help the old biddy celebrate her accomplishment. But no, you're not going to get any such subtleties from the Little Red Hen. If you don't help her, if you don't do what she asks, then you are thoughtless and lazy, and ultimately you will come to no good, and you'll be punished for your sin. And she's not even willing to leave that up to God. Oh no, God might not punish you to her satisfaction. So she personally takes on the job of publicly humiliating you. What I'm saying is that by telling this story with a single goal, a moral stated at the end, we remove the other possibilities of how the story might play out or what it might say to different listeners. And what kind of a moral is that anyway? He who does not work shall not eat. All it does is give an excuse to people who lack compassion for unemployed people or refugees or elderly people whose disabilities are clear but whose abilities are not valued in the marketplace. The whole point of a story is that it's never about just one thing. If it's about one thing, put it on a t-shirt. A story, even a simple story such as The Little Red Hen, is about a whole constellation of personalities and behaviors and social pressures that have much more to say than just one thing. Fact is, in my childhood church, the whole Hebrew Bible, which we dismissively called the Old Testament, had a moral point. It was evidence. It laid the groundwork for the fact that the New Testament was truer and even better, God's own truth, all new and improved. In other words, those ancient stories weren't there because they were important, but because they were proof of the new truth, which was Jesus. And if you accept it as true, you could get into his heavenly palace and live happily ever after. That was what was purported to be true and factual. I call that story abuse. But what if the stories were there not because they were factual, but because they were good stories? Wouldn't that be enough? They'd been told over and over for centuries before they were ever written down. What if we heard the Hebrew Bible story of Joseph being deceived by his older brothers and sold into slavery the same way we hear Cinderella? We feel a very satisfying sense of justice when good, kind Cinderella wins the heart of the prince and her wicked social climbing stepsister's extreme efforts to get the prince's attention fail utterly. In the most satisfying versions, the stepsisters get their eyes pecked out by crows. Now that's poetic justice, which is the best kind as long as it makes no claim to be true. Doesn't it also feel like justice when Joseph goes through all his trials, being a slave, rising to the top slave, being wrongly accused by his master's wife, and being imprisoned? And even there in prison, we see that he is good. He interprets the Pharaoh's dream about the 7 lean cows and the 7 fat cows. And he's made a vizier, and he's given his own princess to marry. That's a good happily ever after story. And what about David, the shepherd boy who became a king? Sure, only one giant for David, but still, like Jack the giant killer, he prevails in all the trials that come his way and gains the treasure and marries the princess. And then there are the tender tales of Ruth and Naomi, Jonathan and David, every bit the tearjerkers, just like the story that people tell on NPR's StoryCorps. And what about Cain and Abel, Esau and Jacob, the youngest son being the good one, of course, like in all good stories, and the oldest one being favored? Again, that's the way stories go. There's the great flood with all those animals, the snake in the garden, and Adam and Eve being kicked out. Noah's Ark, during that flood, all those plagues sent to Egypt, and Moses parting the sea. Jonah in the whale or Daniel in the lion's den. The miracle, no, the magic of the loaves and fishes. And those forbidden acts, Lot's wife looking back against God's orders and being turned into a pillar of salt. It's like Pandora being told, don't open that box. Or Bluebeard's bride unlocking the forbidden door and discovering the truth. And for a happy ending comedy, there's Moses' mother and sister hiding him and him being found by the princess floating in his little basket in the water. And Abraham, when he's sent to kill his son Isaac and then relieved of that duty by Yahweh, who was acting a little red hennish, don't you think? and for tragedy, there's the anguish of Job and the crucifixion of Jesus and the resonant sorrow of his mother. They're all good stories. And if you get to hear them without also having to listen to dogmatic meanings and morals being placed on them by someone else explaining exactly what they really mean, they are great stories. If you're not forced to believe they're true and historical and evidence of some tenet of somebody else's faith. It's like A.S. Byatt says in her lovely book, The Gene in the Nightingale's Eye. She had sat in Sunday school, hearing a fly buzzing against a smeared high window in a vestry, and hated the stories of St. Paul and the other apostles because they were true. They were told her as true stories. And this somehow stopped off some essential imaginative involvement with them. Probably because she didn't believe them if required to believe they were true. But hearing them in the same way we hear other stories, that's also hard to do because they've come down to us with all that baggage. And by now, unloading it is almost impossible. And that's the other side of this coin. Some of the baggage is tradition, added after the books of the Bible were collected and selected, added by popes and preachers and Sunday school curriculum writers. But some of it got written into the text. Whoever was writing the story down, and whenever they wrote it down, it had been told for decades or centuries. But that person writing it put on it their own contemporary interpretation, just like the recorder of the Little Red Hen. And that's the part that's so hard to ignore. People can say, it's in the Bible. Those verses about homosexuality and the way women are subjugated or stoned and what you can and can't eat, I say it's all on account of people taking a fine piece of oral literature and freezing it in time by writing it down. If the stories had never been written down, but just passed along orally, parts of the story would have been dropped or changed as soon as listeners' counterfeit detectors began to tick. Those outdated moral judgments would not have been passed down, only the stories. I can assure you that left to their own devices, stories told orally change over time. Mine do. They get longer or shorter to fit the time allowed. They get saucier or more modest to fit the audience. I learned something new about shoemakers or tinkers, or something about an animal in a tree, and the new knowledge makes its way into the story. Sometimes I have to make something up because I forgot it, and maybe I like the thing I made up better than the way it was before. Someone asks a question or tells me something that changes the way I think of a character, and next time I tell it, it's a little different. If I may, I'd like to tell you a Bible story from an oral tradition. Not a 1,000-year-long oral tradition, but probably several generations. I think you'll be able to hear the difference. In 1994, I was on staff at UTSA's Institute of Texan Cultures. I was probably the newest staff person. We were interviewing black cowboys for a new video, and my job was just to stay with them all day while our videographer called out one or two for an interview. The youngest, Willie, was in his 60s, and the oldest two were in their 90s. And those wiry old guys still worked on the same big ranch on the coastal plains, same ranch they'd always worked on. All day I got to listen to them talk as they reminisced about horses and cattle and each other. And if it was quiet for a minute, Tony would start a hymn and everyone would join in. About mid-afternoon, someone asked Reverend Mac Williams, he was 91 years old, to tell a story. He was a cowboy too, but he preached on Sundays, and he picked the prodigal son story. And in Reverend Mac's version, there was a horse named Old Grace, because I guess it would never occur to a cowboy that anyone would even think about leaving home without their horse. So he told about the son asking for his inheritance and the father giving him his money and a horse, Old Grace. The boy spent his inheritance wildly on women and drink until one day he found himself in the gutter, sick, broke, bemoaning his fate. Old Grace found him and nudged him back, and with great effort he pulled himself onto her back. His body sank into hers, and she gently walked him home. Then Reverend Mac said, the father met him at the gate. He gave his son a big old hug, tears in his eyes, and he said, "Oh, Grace, she will take you there, and she will bring you home. Old Grace, she will take you there, and she will bring you home." And then Tony began singing Amazing Grace, the slowest I ever heard it. And everyone joined in by the second note. I joined in too, but I had to take a breath during zing. That's how slow it was. How sweet. Hearing that story, singing with them, I would not trade that day for all the world. And Reverend Mac's story, recalled from who knows where, reflected upon since who knows when, and that jealous brother was never even mentioned. For Reverend Mac, or perhaps for some Reverend that he'd heard it tell before, it didn't matter. It fell out of the story, allowing the love and the welcoming reunion and the grace to emerge more powerfully. Now that was not a story Mac had read, at least not recently. It was a story he heard or remembered. Someone else might have heard the same story at the same time, and they might be telling all about that jealous brother. And they put the story together entirely differently. But Mac told it the way he remembered it, the way it had meaning for him. And what he heard was about grace, was about love. So that's how he told it. He told it over and over again, and it got better every time. I'm just sure of that. What if all sacred stories had been transmitted orally for centuries? Or if they were published, it'd be published in many different variations that are in print collections in the 398.2 section of your library, folk tales and legends and myths. Would they be different from each other, like Leo told the kids they would be? Would they be alive like Haroon's stream of story? Would they be sacred? Oh, you bet they would. They would have powerful meaning for our day and time, for now. I don't think they would fall short at all. In fact, I think they just might be the greatest stories ever told. Amen. So be it. Blessed be.